Good afternoon and welcome to ThinkTech. My name is Keith Bettinger. I'm your host. And today is February, what is today? February 24th. Thank you very much. Today's February 24th, 2015. It's Tuesday. Thank you for joining us at ThinkTech today. A little later on today's program, we'll be welcoming our guest, Dr. Alan White. Dr. White has been working as a senior scientist for the Nature Conservancy's Global Marine Initiative for almost a decade. He currently serves as the institutional and technical advisor for TNC's Coral Triangle program. Dr. White and I will be talking about the wondrous marine biodiversity in the Coral Triangle region in Southeast Asia, an area that includes territorial waters of Indonesia, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, the Philippines, and Timor-Leste, or East Timor. The area has hundreds of species of reef-building corals, and so Dr. White and I will be discussing the ecological and socioeconomic importance of the region, as well as some challenges and opportunities for conservationists working to preserve the region's natural riches. But before we begin our discussion, though, we'll have our short news summary of ongoing issues around Asia. And just a reminder, if you have any Asia-related events to publicize, please contact me at keiththinktech@gmail.com. You can also send me questions and comments directly via Twitter at KCCGeography. So on to our news summary in Southeast Asia. We'll begin with Thailand's interim parliament, which is dominated by members of the country's military. This week, they passed a law that bans foreigners from paying Thai women to act as surrogate mothers. The rent-a-womb industry, as it's known locally, has made the country a top destination for what's been labeled fertility tourism, which involves traveling to another country to seek fertility treatments. Critics warn that the ban will only succeed in pushing the surrogate mother industry underground in the country, which will increase risks and make it harder for couples and surrogates to access quality medical care. However, the country's lawmakers have been working on some form of surrogacy ban for almost half a decade, but progress has been derailed by successive political crises. In the past year, though, several high-profile cases have served to galvanize support for the ban. The first case, which has been come to be known as the baby gammy case, involves an Australian couple who left behind a twin boy because his surrogate mother, because the infant had Down syndrome. In another case, a Japanese businessman fathered at least 16 babies with Thai surrogates, in a case known popularly in Thailand as the baby factory. It's estimated that 20 to 25,000 couples per year seek assisted reproductive services abroad. Israel is the leading destination due to its high number of in vitro fertilization clinics, though the United States is also a major destination. In terms of surrogacy, India, Russia, and until recently, Thailand are major destinations, and it's estimated that at least 6,000 babies were born via overseas surrogates in 2014. One of the main attractions is cost. Surrogate fees in the United States can top $100,000, whereas services in Thailand cost around $40,000. And in India, charges range between $10,000 and $28,000. Now on to South Asia. In the island state of the Maldives this week, police arrested opposition leader and former President Mohammed Nasheed on terror charges. The arrest stems from events in 2012 when then-President Nasheed detained one of the country's highest-ranking judges on charges related to the obstruction of justice. The arrest of the judge ultimately precipitated the fall of Nasheed's presidency. Nasheed was the Maldives' first democratically elected president, serving from 2008 until 2012 when he resigned amidst an apparent coup. Nasheed garnered international attention for his efforts to bring the world's leaders together in an agreement to limit carbon dioxide emissions in 2009. His efforts, which were ultimately unsuccessful, were depicted in the documentary film, The Island President. The island state of the Maldives, which is comprised of hundreds of low-lying atolls, is one of the most vulnerable countries on the planet to rising seas. Nasheed was succeeded by current President Abdullah Yameen, who was elected in a controversial election in 2013 and is a half-brother of Maumoon Abdul Gayoom, who ruled the country for 3 decades. Analysts say the arrest of the former president will add to the increasing state of instability in the country. Now on to East Asia. In East Asia, North Korea's Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un got a new haircut. unveiling his new look at a meeting of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Workers' Party of Korea last Wednesday. Kim's new look has attracted a great deal of attention in the media. CNN described Kim's new do as a power haircut, whereas the New York Daily News referred to the style as barbarous. Many observers say that the haircut is part of a broader effort on Kim's part, which is rumored to include plastic surgery, to change his appearance to more closely resemble his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, the country's founder, who is said to be still posthumously revered by the North Korean people. In a related story, a report released by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization indicated that North Korea's food shortages seem to be ameliorating slowly, with food production reaching its highest levels since the mid-1990s, when the country's economy collapsed due to mismanagement and corruption. Analysts say that while the increase over last year's production is very slight, it indicates that agricultural reforms that have been implemented since Kim Jong-un took power are starting to have an effect. These reforms include permitting farmers to keep 1/3 of their crop. Now, today's discussion, onto our interview. Today's discussion focuses on the Coral Triangle, an area in the Southwest Pacific Ocean that encompasses some territorial waters of 6 countries, including Indonesia, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, the Solomon Islands, and Timor-Leste, or East Timor. The region is among the richest areas in the world in terms of aquatic biodiversity, with hundreds of species of reef-building coral and more than 3,000 species of fish. It's been referred to as the Amazon of the seas because of its biodiversity, and its biological resources sustain the lives of over more than 100 million people. The Coral Triangle is economically and ecologically critical, but it is also an area that faces threats, including poor resource management and very high exploitative pressures. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Alan White. Dr. White has been with the Nature Conservancy since 2006, when he joined the organization as a senior scientist. He's currently the Coral Triangle Program's institutional and technical advisor in the Indo-Pacific division of the Nature Conservancy. Dr. White has conducted research on management, the conservation, ecology, and economics of coastal resource management systems and marine protected areas. He's also the founding member and president of the Coastal Conservation and Education Foundation, which is based in Cebu City in the Philippines. Dr. White is currently facilitating the design and implementation of the Coral Triangle Marine Protected Areas System in partnership with the six Coral Triangle countries. This project is being supported by the United States Agency for International Development and the Nature Conservancy and regional partners. And also, Dr. White finished his PhD at the Department of Geography at the University of Hawaii. That's perhaps the most important detail. So thank you for joining us today. I'm really happy that you made time to come talk to us today about the Coral Triangle, and I'm really excited to hear about some of your experiences in the area. And it's an area that I have worked in myself, but only on the terrestrial side. So first of all, this Coral Triangle, I think that many of our viewers probably have never heard of the Coral Triangle, and for a long time it was a secret. Essentially. But it's one of the most biodiverse areas in the world in terms of marine resources. So could you tell us a little bit about the Coral Triangle? What is it, where is it, and why is it important in terms of not only biodiversity, but from a socioeconomic perspective as well?
Well, first of all, thanks, Keith, for inviting me to join the show. I'm very pleased to be here.
Thank you.
And it's true, I have worked for many years in the Coral Triangle, and just to answer your question about how the Coral Triangle got started as a name, back in the 1980s, there were a group of scientists that realized there was an incredible diversity of corals and fish in the area. And they were mostly focusing on an area in the southern Philippines, northern Indonesia, which is probably the center of marine biodiversity. And they started to call it the Coral Triangle, because the area they were looking at was kind of shaped like a big triangle. And then probably around 2004, there was a group of scientists that did a more systematic study on looking at the distribution of biodiversity in the region. And they came up with a boundary for the diversity of corals and fish, which included the 6 countries that are part of the Coral Triangle Initiative.
I see.
And these 6 countries, as mentioned, are Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Timor-Leste. And this sort of large area is more or less a triangle, not exactly, but the Coral Triangle concept caught on, and that's how it became the Coral Triangle. But Also, as you mentioned, the diversity is extremely high. It is the center of marine biodiversity for the world.
Sure.
You know, and it produces an incredible amount of valuable resources for people that depend on it. There are more than something like 150 million people that live on the coastal areas of these 6 countries.
That's astonishing.
And many of them depend on fisheries, they depend on coastal tourism or other livelihoods that depend directly on the marine environment.
Wow. So this is an area of about 5.7 million square kilometers, which is about twice as big as India. Based on my calculations.
Yeah.
Well, another question related to that is what is special about this area in terms of the geographic factors? Why is it such a biodiverse area?
Well, I mean, it's a little hard to say in a short dissertation why everything is there in terms of biodiversity, but it probably has something to do with the number of islands and the sort of the variety of habitats in the area.
Oh, I see.
And the variety of sort of oceanographic conditions.
So there's lots of niches.
Historically, there were lots of niches for evolution of species in that area,
and
they were coming there, and it sort of evolved into a very, very diverse region.
So would it be accurate to say that?
And it's also tropical.
Sure.
So because it's tropical, so the reefs, actually something like 31% of the coral reefs in the world are within those 6 countries.
So would it be accurate to say then that that it's more of a collection of a lot of different coral hotspots, different communities,
and different kinds of habitats. I mean, we talk about coral reefs. It's called the Coral Triangle, but we have seagrass beds. We have a very rich mangrove ecosystems.
Right.
We have other kinds of sort of estuarine, freshwater mixing with saltwater that create very biodiverse areas together with mangrove forests.
Right.
So all of this sort of combines to make an incredibly diverse system and a very productive system.
Right. So here we have we're showing a map of the Coral Triangle now, and we can see the kind of the geometry of this area here. Yeah, it ranges from Luzon all the way out to the Solomon Islands and over to looks like Bali, huh? Bali and Java is the border there.
Right, and actually an interesting point. If you look at the red line on the map, that is the so-called scientific boundary of the diversity that we mentioned earlier. But for the whole of the 6 countries, including Indonesia and Malaysia, which is sort of green there on the left, those are the sort of the political jurisdictions of the country. Now, in the development or the formation of the Coral Triangle Initiative, the countries of Indonesia and Malaysia, which were partly cut off by the scientific boundary, said they wanted to be wholly in the Coral Triangle.
Oh, I see.
So the Coral Triangle Initiative really includes all of those 6 countries, not where the red scientific boundary line runs. So the initiative is somewhat different than the scientific boundary for the Coral Triangle.
Well, that's interesting. So another thing about the Coral Triangle in the setup, I talked a little bit about how it's an area that faces some threats.
Yeah.
And normally, I think that most people that are not experts on Southeast Asia but pay attention to marine resources, they think about coral and threats to corals, and the first thing that comes to mind is coral bleaching because of warmer temperatures and greater acidity in the water. However, in our discussion, in our preparation for the show, I was really surprised to find out that it's not really global warming is a threat. But it's not the major challenge that you're working on right now. Could you describe some of the more, I guess, regional and local threats that you're facing?
It was probably the single main threat that triggered the development of the Coral Triangle Initiative was the overuse of the resources by people that live in the areas. In other words, there's overfishing, there's destructive fishing. There are various, impacts on the reefs or the mangroves or the seagrass beds from people doing development activities which are not very well managed. So of course, through all those kinds of impacts, the resilience of the marine ecosystem is going down. And then on top of that, now we have climate change coming in on top of that, which is, we're starting to see warmer sea surface temperatures, which is causing some coral bleaching.
Wow.
But when the resilience of the habitats are already lowered from the local human-related activities, it means that, we're going to be worse off after climate change comes. So we're kind of losing our ability to deal with climate change when it actually kicks in.
Right. Okay, well, we'll come back to that in just a moment.
Sure.
First, we're going to take a break. This is ThinkTech, Asia in Review. My name's Keith Bettinger, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Aloha, I'm Hunter Hevlin, host of Sustainable Hawaii here at ThinkTech Hawaii. You can tune in every week on Thursday at 2 p.m. to see interviews with sustainability professionals from around the state and even further abroad, learning about activities with water management, food security, waste management, and a whole host of other fascinating opportunities to get engaged with making a greener island. So if you're interested in making the transition from consuming individuals to communities of producers, check us out every Thursday.
Hi, I'm Jay Fidel. That's Ted Ralston. You know, Ted is the host of Where the Road Leads. It shows every Friday from 4 to 5 p.m. It's about technology. It's about how people collaborating and solve problems with modern technology. It's where the road leads. We all know that. We should all be listening. Join us there, 4 to 5 p.m. every Friday. Now, what about that do you agree with?
All of it.
I knew he'd say that. Aloha. Say aloha.
Aloha.
Good.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. My name is Keith Bettinger. I'm your host, and today we're talking about the Coral Triangle in Southeast Asia and marine biodiversity in the region. And I'm joined here at ThinkTech Studios by Dr. White. And we were talking just a minute ago about threats to the biodiversity in the Coral Triangle, and you mentioned fishing. And so I'm curious as to whether the primary threat is commercial fishing or subsistence fishing. So in this area, there's a lot of artisanal fishermen. Who is putting the pressure on the reefs?
Maybe we start with the commercial fishermen. I mean, in most of these countries, they have laws about the commercial fishermen have to stay a certain distance from the shoreline, depending on the size of their vessel.
Right.
So when the commercial fishermen break the rule about how close they can fish to the shoreline, they impinge on the fisheries of the more, the artisanal sector.
Sure.
So the initial problem is really maintaining sort of the territory for the artisanal and leave the offshore areas to the commercial.
Sure.
So that's kind of a law enforcement problem. But then when you start looking at the artisanal fishery and the activities they do, many of them also use unsustainable fishing methods. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they're using explosives, or they're using poisons, or they're using very fine mesh nets, mm-hmm. and things like that, which then, of course, draw down the fishery and overfish the fishery. So it's a combination of both.
Maybe some people are not aware of these types of destructive fishing methods, but you mentioned explosives. Another method that I've seen in other places, acid, not acid, but poison in the water.
Sodium cyanide. Yeah.
And in Vietnam, I one time saw electrifying the fish.
Yeah.
So in terms of the explosives, what types of explosives are people using, and where do they get them?
Well, the explosives are they're actually, it's a homemade explosive.
Okay.
And they can develop a very simple small bomb from fertilizer. And then they can make a blasting cap, and they mostly do that on coral reefs where the fish are in shallow water.
Yep.
And they throw the bomb into the water, and then immediately the fish are dead.
It blows the coral reef
But
apart.
it has a very destructive impact on the reef and the habitat in that area. And actually many of the fish are lost.
Sure.
Because some of the fish die, they sink to the bottom, they can't even find all the fish. So
right.
It's obviously not a good method to use.
So we have a lot of problems with overfishing, I think, here in Hawaii, and I've noticed in my time here that there are significant outreach efforts to teach people about the dependency on the reef. The reef acts as a nursery for fish.
Right.
In Hawaii, some people are dependent on the fisheries, but I would venture a guess that most fishing is recreational.
More recreational, yeah.
In the Philippines and in Indonesia, it's probably the reverse situation. And so the people are more dependent for their actual livelihoods, but at the same time, they're using these explosive destructive methods that actually destroy the resource base. So are they aware of the damage that they're doing to the long-term sustainability of the resource, or is it just a question of ignorance?
I mean, actually, in a lot of our programs that we're involved in the region, it's really to educate people about, why these methods are destructive.
So you
and
find
there
that
is
people are
there's
not
a
aware
decline.
of...
They're not aware, but they're becoming much more aware.
I see.
And actually, there's quite a big decline in the use of the destructive methods in in recent years.
Is that right? So is it now that's very interesting. Is the decline, would you say that it's attributable to a personal decision that people are making, or is there more of a community pressure that's placed on people using these destructive methods? Is there a ostracism,
No.
in other words?
I mean, it's a combination of communities realizing that when they destroy their resource, they also have less production and they have lower income. So they're learning that for themselves. They're also being assisted in their planning, and they're also looking at models of areas that are better, where there's better management, and they see that if they can protect their reef and maybe sustainably harvest the fish in the area, that they really have a much higher income.
Right.
So they're starting to share these lessons among themselves. And the local governments are working with communities to try and set up better management systems through the implementation of small marine protected areas, where fishing is stopped in a core area, and then more sustainable fishing is allowed in the area outside of the no fishing zone.
Sure.
And the fishermen immediately see that there are benefits by doing that.
Right.
So they tend to start to replicate that themselves within their own communities. And we're seeing more and more of that in Philippines and parts of Indonesia and several other countries in the Coral Triangle. So.
Okay, well, we'll be back in just thank you very much. We'll be back in just a moment here at ThinkTech. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay, this is ThinkTech Hawaii, and it's Wednesday. Every Wednesday is Energy Wednesday here in Hawaii, the state of clean energy. 4 to 5 p.m. every Wednesday. Come and listen to us. And just to show you what I mean, I'm going to ask Sharon to tell us more.
Come and see us every Wednesday, as Jay said. And we have people like Jim Albers from HECO here, and co-host Ray Starling here every Wednesday. We not only go on Olelo and OC16, but also stream live. So please come visit us, hear about the latest in clean energy.
Okay, Jim, you've been here. You got any comment on all this?
As important as energy is in all of our lives today, this is a great forum and a great format to vet those issues. So I encourage everybody to listen in and participate.
Okay, Ray, what do you think for a close?
Well, I think this is the greatest show in the energy world here in Hawaii. You can come here every week, 1 hour, and catch the latest on what's happening and hear from the people who really know what's going on, like Jim Alberts. We appreciate your coming today.
Thank you.
Ray Starling, Sharon Moriwaki, Jim Alberts, and Jay Fidel here in Hawaii, the state of clean energy. 4 to 5 p.m. Wednesday. Aloha. Aloha.
Welcome back to ThinkTech. My name is Keith Badinger. I'm joined in the studio today by Dr. White from the Nature Conservancy. We're talking about the Coral Triangle and marine biodiversity in Southeast Asia. Now we've got a graphic here that shows stressors on the reef and fish. And maybe you can explain this to us here. On one side, it looks like we've got a bleached, unhappy reef, and then on the right-hand side, we've got a beautiful, vibrant, living reef. And so what is this, what's this diagram showing us?
Well, very simply, on the left side, what we see is a reef that's maybe stressed by increasing water temperature, possibly pollution, most likely overfishing, destructive fishing methods, anything that causes some damage to the marine ecosystem, and probably even, in some cases, physical damage to the reef. But on the right side, what we see is an area that at least has some level of protection. The fish are allowed to grow to normal sizes so that they're feeding on algae and they're able to sort of maintain a natural balance within the marine ecosystem on the coral reef. So it's kind of showing that gradient between very poorly managed to an ideally managed coral reef. And of course, we're working towards the right side in all of our conservation work in the Coral Triangle to try and bring the coral reefs back to a more natural and healthy state of being, where there are more fish and there are healthy corals, and it's in a state that's useful for people.
Sure. All right. Well, thanks for explaining that. Another topic that we've talked about in the past is this concept of differential vulnerability. So in short, what that means is that different groups of people, for whatever reason, are more vulnerable to environmental degradation than other groups. And so the impacts of environmental degradation are not felt symmetrically or evenly across society. And so my question is, do you see this? Do you see these types of impacts, these differential impacts in the coral triangle when you have observed environmental degradation there?
I mean, it varies a lot from one country to another, and of course the geography is quite different. But in general, the fishing communities tend to be rather poor communities, and they depend. A large extent of their food and livelihood comes from fisheries or some, related income. And so consequently, when, if their coral reef is damaged or there's a high level of pollution or some impact of development, the poor fishing community tends to be the first one that feels the negative impact of that, because I mean, it varies from one place to another. But then there are communities that have begun to realize that by managing their resources, they can bring some of that back to themselves. And in some cases, they're converting a little bit more to tourism as an income. And then they, can begin to benefit from some of that. So it's incredibly variable across the region as to what extent any given community is affected. But fishing communities do tend to be on the marginal side of society.
Right.
Because they're also it's not a highly educated community. They have specific skills, they can do certain things, but they can't transfer themselves into other jobs so easily, things like that.
So does the fishing community, is it, I guess in a lot of places, a fishing community would be a big informal sector occupation. Does it tend to absorb labor from elsewhere, low-skilled labor, not necessarily people that grew up in these communities, but is there migration to coastal communities?
I mean, if anything, there's a migration out of coastal communities,
Oh, is
but
that right?
often for coastal fishing communities, because they don't have access to so many resources, more the children of those families tend to go into fishing. But if they have an opportunity, they'll tend to migrate to the city. So in Southeast Asia, there has been quite a large migration from the smaller fishing communities into urban centers, which is why we have such large urban growth, because they see the opportunities there.
Right.
But even so, population's growing, and it's often growing beyond the capacity of the environment to provide natural resources.
Sure.
So it's.
So another thing that you mentioned that's very interesting that I'd like to follow up on, you mentioned that fishing communities are marginalized in a lot of places, economically marginal, maybe politically marginal as well, which would mean that their influence in policy making is negligible at best. What I've observed, and there's a pretty significant literature about this, about marginalized people, is that or impoverished people, tend to put more stress on their natural environment. They tend to put more extractive pressure because they don't have the luxury not to.
Right.
So they stress the environment more, and I'm wondering if in fishing communities, if that is the case as well in the Coral Triangle, and if it is the case, does there seem to be a sort of economic threshold, and once people are above that threshold, do they stop putting additional stress on the ecological resources?
I mean, that's an excellent point. I mean, first of all, fisheries are limited. So of course, the fishing communities do depend on fisheries, but when there's too many people extracting the fish, then of course they've gone beyond the threshold of what that fishery will sustain.
So it's there's population pressure.
Population pressure, and also they're using more efficient methods. They're learning how to be more effective in the way they catch fish.
I see.
So on the one hand, they need to manage that, but on the other hand, they're looking for alternative sources of livelihood. And although fishing communities have limited choices, as mentioned, some of them are beginning to realize that they can start to enter into tourism enterprises.
Sure.
Where people will come to visit their village and maybe even pay them a small fee to visit their coral reef or visit their protected area, and generate income through services to visitors to their area.
Right.
And in places in the Coral Triangle where they've learned how to do that, they've been able to increase their income substantially.
And they also diversify
so they diversify their sources of income.
Right, makes the community as a whole more resilient.
And it also builds in a natural incentive for them to manage their natural areas so that it's still aesthetically pleasing and in a fairly healthy state for people that will come to visit and for themselves.
So when you talk about tourism, and this is another interesting topic, because most of the countries of the region, have grown pretty significantly over the past 50 years. Some have been more successful, like Malaysia has been more successful. The Philippines is on the way up, but they've stuttered a little bit. But for the most part, these countries are experiencing pretty rapid rates of growth. And I know that in Indonesia and Malaysia, you have kind of a middle class that's growing. So when we talk about tourism, where are the tourists coming from?
In that region, they tend to more come from Japan and from China.
So they're international?
They're international tourists, but they're also national. I mean, in Philippines, if you look at the scuba diving industry, there's many people that live in the larger urban centers of Manila and Cebu that are using scuba diving as a primary recreation.
Is that right?
And then they go out and they use the services, and it benefits the local communities.
So is that a recent development?
In the last 10 years,
really?
for the most part, yeah.
So is that happening in Indonesia and elsewhere?
And also in Indonesia, areas that are not too far from urban centers. For example, there's a place called Mabini, which is south of Manila in the Philippines, where the community is now catering. There may be more than 100 small resorts, which are locally owned, that are catering mostly to people that live in Manila.
Wow.
And so it's changed the whole social economic sort of context of those communities, and generally for the better.
Sure.
It's also made them less dependent on fishing and some of the other more traditional activities that they done in the past.
Right. So you mentioned, I think you said Chinese tourists. Before I rudely interrupted you.
Yeah.
Chinese. So the Chinese market is growing as well.
It's growing as well. Yeah, Chinese, Japanese, Korean. Many coming to those countries.
So what are the? I know this may be outside of your field a little bit, and so don't answer this question if you don't want to. Yeah. Sometimes there's different preferences between different groups of tourists. Chinese tourists, what are their preferences? What do they like to go see?
Well, like you say, I'm not an expert on the tourists, but I do see Chinese tourists coming and wanting to go into the marine waters.
Is that right?
I mean, often they're not scuba divers, but they like to snorkel and see the fish and go to the beach, and a bit like we see in Hawaii as well.
Well, that's got to be a massive growth market.
And
right?
Sometimes they're not as sensitive to the to the local environment, but the things that they're learning. And
Sure.
tourism is starting to go in the right direction.
Right. So now you have alluded a little bit over our discussion to what the Nature Conservancy and other organizations are doing in the area. Can you tell us explicitly about the form your activities are taking in terms of capacity building, and what other organizations are working there? Are there organizations active in conservation-related activities that focus on the Coral Triangle domestically, or is it just international organizations?
It's a combination of international and domestic. Each country has its own national, local, non-government organizations that are working in marine conservation or fisheries management. And each country also has an assortment of international non-government organizations like the Nature Conservancy or others. Now, for example, the Nature Conservancy works in Indonesia, Solomon Islands, and Papua New Guinea in the Coral Triangle. It doesn't work in all 6 countries.
I see.
And in those countries, it tends to work at the community level and also on national policy for improved marine resource management.
I see.
At the same time, the Nature Conservancy works in what we call the regional Coral Triangle program, where we're helping the 6 countries do planning at the regional scale.
So when we come back from our break, I'll ask you about the form that international collaboration takes. My name is Keith Bettinger. This is ThinkTech Asia Weekly. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back in just a moment.
Hi, my name is Andrew Howard. I'm an astronomer at the Institute for Astronomy at the University of Hawaii up in Manoa. I'd like to tell you about the annual open house that we're having. This year it is on April 6th, 11 to 4 p.m. It's an all ages event, kids, grown-ups, even people in between, everyone is welcome. We have a lot of really fun activities. You get to meet astronomers, look at yourself in an infrared camera, play with Legos, make robots, look at videos. You can even some of the kids like to make comets out of gravel and snow. Even adults like to do that too. You'll be able to look at the sun with a solar camera safely. It's really a great activity. We do this every year in April, and I hope to see you this year. Thanks.
Aloha, Yappers. This is your host, Kingsley, for the Yap Show. Every Friday, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. You can catch us here live, ThinkTech Hawaii, and then later on, we upload to our YouTube channel. We talk about youth issues, policies, youth programs, and how to transition yourself into adulthood.
But this was like a sign, I guess. Hey, life's like, hey, right. Now's your chance to go back to school, which I'm doing.
Catch us here again live, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. Aloha.
Hi, aloha. My name is Chris Leatham, and I host a show called The Economy and You. The show plays every Wednesday at noon, and on my show, I bring on guests who are interested or working in the technology space. And so I'd like you to come and watch the show and learn with me about all the sort of exciting things that we're doing in Hawaii to build and grow our economy ecosystem. So I'd like to say aloha, and I look forward to seeing you on the show. Thank you.
Aloha, my name is Paul Jackson, better known as PJ, and my local interest is in sports. I have my own sports radio show at KWAI AM 1080 that you can stream live. I also have my own website, pjsportsradio.com. We have live guests in studio, and we talk about discussions and topics that everyone wants to know locally here on the islands. We cover everything from surfing to basketball to whatever's going on locally, sports-wise. We try to do our best and cover the topics in depth as much as we can. Once again, thank you for joining PJ here on Hawaii Sports Update. Mahalo.
Okay, welcome back to Asia in Review. My name is Keith Bettinger, and today we're talking about the coral triangle and marine diversity in Southeast Asia. And before we went to the break, we were talking about international cooperation in Southeast Asia and multilateral efforts to create protected areas. And so maybe you can tell us a little bit about, it seems like TNC has an important capacity building role in terms of governance and maybe almost lobbying, writing, helping to write legislation and like that.
Well, TNC has been very active working with national governments on doing their marine spatial planning for sort of determining the best areas for protected areas, and then helping the government sort of design protected areas with proper zoning and locations so that they can really be most effective. And
here we're showing your regional plan of action. So can you tell us what this is, a regional plan of action Coral Triangle on initiative?
Well, the Coral Triangle Initiative, when it was launched in year 2009 by the 6 countries of the Coral Triangle, they developed what's called a regional plan of action. And the regional plan of action has 5 basic goals. One is to work on seascapes. The second one is to work on improved fisheries management. The third goal is to improve the management of marine protected areas.
Wow.
The fourth one is to adapt to climate change within all their activities. And the fifth one is to protect vulnerable and endangered species.
So it's a holistic effort.
So it's a very holistic plan, which each country has bought into. And the Nature Conservancy's role in that is to sort of help coordinate some of the planning for different parts of this plan within the countries.
Right.
And then to help them develop sort of a more regional monitoring system for taking progress.
So this word that you mentioned, the first pillar of this program, seascapes. What is a seascape?
Well, the seascape is a large area which has some affinity, ecological affinity. For example, the first seascape in the Coral Triangle that's sort of recognized before the Coral Triangle program got started is the Sulu Sulawesi seascape. And that's a seascape that includes the Sulu Sea, the Sulawesi Sea, and includes parts of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines. It's kind of the southern area there in those 3 countries. And they call it a seascape because there's a lot of commonality within that general large ecosystem. And the point is to begin to get the countries and all the stakeholders to manage that resource as a unit, because it's a very important ecological unit.
I see.
So they call it a seascape.
So is it similar, is it analogous to the landscape approach when dealing with terrestrial conservation?
Similar in the landscape or watershed approach, where you have a common watershed which affects the whole larger ecosystem.
Sure.
So it's kind of the same in the marine environment.
Right.
And the affinities may be certain kinds of fisheries or a similar kind of coral reef, and some maybe oceanographic features which make it kind of unique in the area. But so you can think of it as a very large marine protected area.
I see.
Yeah.
Sure. All right. Well, that's very interesting. I really appreciate you being here today. I think we've all learned a lot about marine conservation in Southeast Asia and the efforts, the work that Nature Conservancy is doing, along with the countries down there too. making it as locally rooted effort as possible. So thank you again for joining us today. I hope to maybe have you on the program again sometime in the
glad
future.
I could join.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now on to our weekly Cultural Corner segment, where we highlight some aspect of an Asian culture through performance. This week we're spotlighting a musical ensemble from Hong Kong known as the Chinese Music Virtuosi, who this past weekend played a couple of events at the University of Hawaii. The members of the Chinese Music Virtuosi are accomplished teachers and performers of traditional Chinese musical instruments. They started the ensemble in 1997 to promote Chinese instrumental music, from cherished oldies to newly commissioned works. This past weekend, the ensemble was joined by Dr. Frederick Lau of the UH Department of Music and Lai Yi-chi, also from the UH Department of Music. The ensemble played music composed by UH faculty along with other newly commissioned work. Our clip this week features members of the Chinese Music Virtuosi performing the Ditty of Henan at the Hong Kong Arts Festival. We hope you enjoy it, and as we wrap things up, I'd like to express my thanks to Fred Lau, the arts coordinator at the East-West Center, for his assistance. Next week on the program, we'll be joined by Dr. Paula Harrell from Georgetown University, who will be discussing China-Japan relations. That's it for this week, and we hope you'll join us again next week at 4 p.m. on ThinkTech Asia. Aloha and ahuiho.